Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another edition of Mere Tradition. I have a very special guest today, Dr. Christopher Manion, and he is the author of a very timely book about the U.S. bishops, and his thesis is essentially that the American Catholic Church has become just another NGO. And we're going to discuss this as we go. Stay tuned. Dr. Manion, should I say Dr. Manion? Christopher, how should I address you?
Chris is fine.
Chris. Well, thank
hmm
you. Thank you for coming on my program, and I'm really excited to talk about your book. I do want to give a little bit of biographical information so everybody can know who we're speaking to today. So I'll read from the back of the book. Christopher Manion earned a PhD in government from the University of Notre Dame, and has taught at Boston University, Catholic University, and Christendom College, very good institutions. He has written extensively for numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Human Life Review, and National Review. A co-founder of the American Foreign Policy Council, he has lived and traveled frequently in Latin America and served as staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere during the Reagan administration, a Knight of Malta, and lives with his family in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Does that cover all the relevant details?
Fair enough.
Fair enough. Very good. Okay, so you've written this book, and this is very timely. You and I were discussing just before we came on. You published this book before all the U.S. aid stuff came out, and I've written a few books, and every time you publish, there's always something like buyer's remorse, where you publish it and you go, oh man, I should have included this, or if I had have known that, I would have put that in too, but there's still tons in there.
There is.
Yeah.
In this case, I started in 2009 with an appearance at a good Catholic group and started asking the questions about what is Catholic charity after all, because it was becoming more and more evident that Catholic charity and government support were becoming increasingly intertwined. And then I talked to the folks at Catholics for Catholics just a year and a half ago about uh, how we got here. We were discussing the fix that the church is in, because it is, and that's undeniable, and the American hierarchy specifically, because the church is not the bishops, the church is the body of Christ. But we've got a problem here in the United States and in the hierarchy. I decided to start finding out where it all started and how we got here. So that's where the book begins 150 years ago.
That's excellent. And I am in Canada, different, obviously, Bishops' Conference, but similar things, especially with all that news about the residential schools and the mass graves that don't
Oh,
exist.
yeah.
Similar things where, I wrote an article for Crisis, basically an open letter to our bishops of Canada saying, would you please say something? Goodness gracious, it's just crazy. And they just won't. And it's really unfortunate. But you bring up the issue of charity. And this ties into the first question, because you open the book with an anecdote about a woman and her check at a social services center. And
Yes.
she frames it as a government charity. She asks basically for her government charity. And what inspired you to start here, and how do you see this shift from this sort of virtue of charity to entitlement, and this playing out in the church?
Well, that happened over 20 years ago when I was at the local county building to interview the director of uh, child protection and so on, because at that time, the child protective services were hassling homeschoolers here in our county, and there are a lot of them, a lot of good Catholic people here. And this gal, while I'm waiting, this gal walks in, and she was not well, um, and stands there and shouts, "Where's my check?" And from behind the bulletproof glass at the other end of the room, "Sit down." And that was the introduction of my curiosity to the question of what is government charity. Then, as I move forward, kind of digging around, I remember that my father, who was at Catholic University in the early years of the 20th century, had met Cardinal Gibbons, James Cardinal Gibbons. And he was the primate of America, being the Archbishop of Baltimore, the first see of our country. And Cardinal Gibbons, I began to discover, had a very interesting history with regard to both the government and charity. In the late 1880s, he had made it clear that government support of the church had gotten the bishops and the church in Europe in trouble in all sorts of ways, and that we should definitely stay away from government support of the church, period. And he was a very he was very solid on the virtue of charity as being one of the, of course, the highest theological virtue. So I started there because he established a very good relationship with the president, Benjamin Harrison, at the time. The church would be independent and Catholics would be good Americans, but the church would provide, and that includes all the Christian sects, the church would provide the morality for the government and for the country. And the government would provide the protection and security for the churches and for the Christians in the country. Because in 1892, the Supreme Court unanimously declared that this is a religious country, and most of the justices said, "Hey, this is Christian as well as religious," and that was a fact that was embraced throughout the time. So it started with all with Cardinal Gibbons and moving forward, and he he constitutes the first uh, couple of 3 chapters of the book because he wanders a long way before his death in the 1920s.
This is a fascinating subject for me because I've been really wrestling with the kingship of Christ and how to understand that in our
Mm-hmm.
modern day. You know, I gave a talk at a men's conference in February about Quas Primas. We're in the 100th anniversary of Quas Primas from Pius XI, and
Mm-hmm.
the history of the American church is very unique, because it's kind of in the West, in the New World, it's kind of the only place where Catholicism wasn't, at least initially, the founding religion, so to speak. Like, even in Canada, we had the takeover by the British at the Plains of Abraham battle with Montcalm, and Wolfe, but they inherited sort of the French kingdom, and they still allowed it to foster and so forth. So even in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
we always had an official Catholicism, whereas in America, obviously, it's a Protestant sort of origin from a Protestant country, with the loyalists and the Continentals and so forth. So you have this searching for, how do we have this true Catholic spirit within a country that's not really from our religion, if that makes sense. So I was fascinated by your mention of Gibbons in the book, because he really is this figure of trying to find this way to harmonize the faith of Catholics with the very unique American patriotism. How do you think that has changed? I mean, was his legacy that it
Mm-hmm.
lasted, or what's happened to that sense of Catholic patriotism for Americans?
Well, that patriotism he declared in 1884 and again, right up and through the First World War. His challenge in the 19th century was to have Catholics accepted as real Americans because the Protestants, the Congregationalists in the north, Episcopals in the south, there was a lot of blood in
Yeah.
that trail in Europe, in the old country. So he wanted to make sure that Americans embraced Catholics as good Americans. He insisted, for instance, in assimilation, to the point where he insisted at one instance that Germans who came over, especially during the 1880s after the Kulturkampf, the German Catholics stuck together, and they had Vereine and other German things in the communities where they began with German schools and German parishes. And he said, you must speak English in the, not in the mass, of course, but uh, in the homilies, because we are not a bi or tri-national church. Now we go forward to the First World War. What did patriotism mean then? Very quickly, Cardinal Gibbons decided that if Catholics were allowed in large numbers to oppose entry into the World War, and by the way, at the time, this is mysterious. At the time, the vast majority of all Americans were against getting into another European war. They'd come over here to escape that. In 1916, my dad was a grad student at Catholic University. And on the elections of 1916, the war had begun 2 years before in Europe. In the election of 1916, on election night, a crowd had gathered in front of the Democrat National Committee, chanting, "We want Wilson one time more. We want peace. We don't want war." And my dad was the cheerleader, Catholics for Wilson. So with that, uh, there was no way that Cardinal Gibbons wanted to permit Catholics to become outcasts from the growing sentiment for war that Wilson, as we recall, very sternly and dramatically enforced. We had Catholic Irish
Yep.
who in 1916 were being exterminated on the Easter Day Rebellion by the British. And we had Catholic Germans who didn't want to fight against their cousins in Germany. There's no reason for us to do that, they thought. Well,
Yeah.
they came into line, and Cardinal Gibbons said the Catholics will serve in greater numbers proportionally than any other group, and they did.
Mm.
Now, that
Wow.
note, what happened was that patriotism was thus cemented not only to love of country, but to love of the government. And that is a big shift
Mm.
that is hardly noticeable in the record. But looking back, that was the first step towards the Catholic Church moving towards a unification with the government. And the book traces the steps that followed in terms of uh, the movement, first of the political and then the magisterial development there.
That's really like that's fascinating because one can understand, especially with the social encyclicals, why this strong desire to serve the state and state serve the church is consistent with the sort of Catholic mentality, but it gets co-opted. It gets co-opted when you talk about this with the rise of soft socialism. And there's a Father John Ryan around 1909 who you talk about in the book. And this seems to be a key turning point in the narrative. Why do you think the
I,
bishops, maybe you could explain this person and why the bishops embraced it so fully, in your opinion?
well, it didn't all happen at once. In 1909, uh, Father John Ryan, as a graduate student at the time, finishing his PhD at Catholic U, Father John Ryan uh, wrote the beautiful description of Catholic charity in the old Catholic encyclopedia that was published between 1908 and 1913. He also strongly uh, defended the church's sound magisterium against the uh, atheists of his time who were already preaching small families are American families, because that gives the
Mm,
children a chance for advancement in society. He took them on big time all the way through his life, all the way through the 1930s. At the same time, in 1919, after the First World War ended, the Catholic bishops decided to preserve the small group they had started in Washington to help families of soldiers and soldiers uh, in the First World War on the East Coast. There was no Western Pacific theater at the time. They decided uh, to keep that group together and form the Catholic Welfare Council, which was the first U.S. Catholic Conference in 1919. Father Ryan wrote the first letter, the first pastoral letter for American bishops, in which he advocated uh, pretty much socialism, but not revolutionary socialism.
mm,
He was a Fabian socialist, if you will,
yeah.
and his dissertation at Catholic U had the same tone.
Mm. There, yeah, I just found his article as you were saying that. There's this article in the Catholic Encyclopedia, Father Ryan, on charity. And,
Beautiful.
that's the Fabian socialism. That was going around. Chesterton, even Belloc in some ways, they kind of had this Fabian background and they all kind of let it go. They all kind of let it go, and it's used against men like Chesterton as a way of beating him over the head of not being being a good Catholic. But then obviously he moved on from that. But there was something in the water, wasn't there? Do you think it was the war? Do you think it was just the sheer bloodshed or something that just kind of broke their perception on it or something?
Well, the war was devastating to England,
Yeah.
and well, it was devastating to the United States too. But
Yeah.
I think, as we'll see moving forward, wars had a very big impact on domestic politics.
Yeah.
And here I am, people, what are you writing about? Well, I'm writing about love. I'm writing a book about love. Oh, really? In 150 years of love.
Yeah.
So, how much time do you have? Well, I tried to focus on that development of charity as Father Ryan explained it beautifully in his letter that you have before you, in his article. He says that government charity is inefficient, is indiscriminate, and um, doesn't nearly do the job
Hmm.
of the private charity for reasons, of course, that government can't love. I mean, it boils down to that. That's
Yeah.
not charity,
Yeah.
it's something else. But moving forward, because not only the war, but the crash of 1929 affected millions of Americans in the poverty stricken way that Father Ryan and the bishops fully united with Roosevelt's New Deal
Yeah.
and supported it throughout. The dean of the Catholic University in 1936 said that uh, all the bishops, maybe three, didn't vote for Roosevelt that year. Ryan was on, remember my father in 1916, before the DNC, we want Wilson one time more. Once more, Wilson didn't want war. Roosevelt didn't want war. And 1940, he didn't either. But Ryan supported him because he needed the welfare programs to uh, he supported the welfare programs that Roosevelt had instigated. Now, my libertarian friends would tell me that Roosevelt perpetuated the Depression and so on. And my father, by the way, was working for Roosevelt at the time. So I wish I could have him here as a guest. His spirit lives because he died a Democrat. And one of the things that Father Ryan proved through the 1930s was that the Democrats and the bishops were united.
Mm.
In that regard, you might have noticed in October, just last October, RFK Jr., now Secretary of Health in the administration, he spoke somewhere out west and said, my great great grandfather came to the United States in 1848 from Ireland. And he came, and he and his people were impoverished, they were starving, and they were welcomed by the Democrat Party. And we have been Democrats ever since. Well, what he didn't mention was the Bishop of Boston was the one who sent the money to the bishops in Ireland to pay his great great grandfather's way to Boston. And the Democrat Party and the Catholics have been united since then. I mean, uh, it was a fait accompli all the way through the Roosevelt years, and uh, the tension, if there was any, uh, had not yet become evident because in the 30s, the Casti Connubii
Mhm.
and the teaching of the church on the magisterial, on marriage, etc. The Episcopalians were beginning to wander back there in
Yeah.
1930,
Lambeth
which
Conference, right?
prompted, yeah,
Yeah.
the Lambeth Conference. And so we had not yet begun to wander publicly. But then came the Second World War. And the Second World War was devastating, and it really was a world war.
Yeah.
And after that war ended, there was a united bipartisan sense on the part of both parties and a great deal of the cultural world that wars had to be avoided and that they were caused by growing populations. Look at Lebensraum in Germany. More Germans mean more Germany. And they blamed that war on the expansionist designs of Adolf Hitler. And they looked at the third world, which at the time was populating itself very quickly, and declared the third world population growth to be an enemy of peace.
Mm.
So in 1962, we find now what's on the headlines, the Agency for International Development, proposed by John F. Kennedy. It was founded as a population control group. We don't hear that much, but I learned it in the 1970s, close up and personal, in my travels in Latin America. And in 1980, in the 80s, when I was handling AID in Latin America, the Catholic relief services down there had to work alongside groups that had population control as one of their segments of their contracts. The reason was that AID told those countries, if you don't accept population control, what they call it family planning,
Mm.
you don't get clean water, you don't get good agriculture,
Yeah.
you are out of luck with the U.S. aid, which, as you know, even then, a dollar went a long way in Guatemala. And that meant an awful lot to the folks down there. And all of the, I want to be careful here, all of the corruption aside, because there were payoffs at every level in Latin America, as in many other corrupt third world countries. And AID had to pay them. And they apparently did a good deal with the American NGOs themselves. But the ground was set. Republican, Democrat, it didn't matter. AID was for population control, and it continued under Reagan with Carl Anderson, who came from the Helms office where I was working, Jesse Helms, the pro-life leader in the Senate of his generation, really. Carl Anderson went to the White House and worked out with the administration the Mexico City policy
Yep.
of 1984. Now, that prevented federal dollars being used for narrow, but any abortion and so on. But the abortion lobby is huge and very well financed. And they kept coming back. And as we know now, the Mexico City policy was maintained by Reagan and Bush 43 and Bush 41, and by the Republicans since Bush and Reagan, Bush and Trump, but the Democrats, Clinton, Obama, and Biden, uh, had executive orders rescinding it the first day of their in office. So that population control continued, but abortion was attenuated visibly. But of course, the WHO, the UN, and a lot of other groups were financing abortions and performing them all over the third world.
You know, I'm reminded, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just tuning in, we are speaking about this book by Dr. Christopher Manion, an expert in foreign policy and basically Catholic funding and Catholic charities internationally as an American. And it is about the Catholic Church in America becoming so deeply involved with government grants that it has, in many ways, become just another NGO, made all the more relevant by the recent U.S. aid release of information scandal, we might call it, and you can find a link for that book in the description to this video. You know, Christopher, as you're talking about this, it's amazing. I guess it's tragic, but this desire to control the world's population. Chesterton was fighting this in the early 1900s in England, and Churchill was an advocate of. It was euthanasia, but it was really sterilization of, the unclean, obviously many handicapped individuals, but just lower society. They could make up any kind of handicap they wanted to. And Francis Galton in the UK in the 1800s is trying to push the population control. They were talking about a wheat shortage coming or a food shortage coming in the late 1800s in the Times and things like that in London if the world population was over 550 million or something. And it's just been the same old song and dance the entire time. And leading the charge against all these anti-Christ, anti-human ideologies was the Catholic Church. But what you show us here is that there kind of was this perfect storm with this unity between the Democrats and the Catholic consensus in America and the funding. Is that
That's a key that started, as I point out, and you point out, in the 18th century.
Yeah.
But here we have in 1910, the Planned Parenthood of America was founded.
Yep.
In the 20s, you have the Rockefellers already working in third world countries trying to push birth control. After World War II, you have John D. Rockefeller III starting the Population Council in 1954. Eleanor Roosevelt was very pro birth control, and she was still around and well during the entire period of the 1950s and early 1960s, beating the drum. She was kind of a heroine of that sector of the Democrat Party. And along comes John D. Rockefeller, who recognizes the Catholic Church, as you point out, is the number one enemy of population control. So John D. Rockefeller III went to Father Theodore Hesburgh, a lifelong friend of mine. I've known him since I was 3, God rest his soul. My dad taught at Notre Dame. We had priests over at the house all the time. Father Hesburgh was the chaplain of the little village that we built on the campus for veterans coming out of World War II so they could finish their degrees or go to law school, where my dad was the dean. So I saw a lot of them even when I was a little kid, because he was the chaplain there and a wonderful, very affable man. During the 1960s, however, he longed for elite status for Notre Dame. And that took two paths. Number one, Rockefeller insisted that he embrace the liberal sector, if you will, of the culture. Uh, and Notre Dame and Father Hesburgh did not stand up forcefully against contraception and the pill during the 1960s, when I was a student there, by the way, and instead hosted secret meetings above 2 or 3 stories above my little carrel in the library with Planned Parenthood and other uh, coalition groups in order to, if you will, soften the stance of the Catholic Church. By 1967, all of the universities that had the Catholic in their name, some 40 of them, signed what is called the Land O'Lakes Agreement, severing them from the Catholic faith officially and the magisterium. And the purpose was so-called academic freedom.
Yeah.
The other side of that sad specter is the embrace of federal funding. They realized that they could not be great research universities and all the rest without federal funding. The federal
Mhm.
government was just spreading money all around, and we need to be uh, down there at the trough along with everybody else. And that required that their boards of directors comprise only laity or controlled by laity. So
Yeah.
Notre Dame did that, and every other Catholic university followed suit. And then, a year later, along comes Humane Vitae.
Yep.
What happened? Massive resistance. I would call it revolutionary.
Yep. Um, well, sadly, one of the most pernicious places of revolution against Humane Vitae was in the Canadian Conference of Bishops. It was called the
Oh
Winnipeg
my.
Statement. Now, in fairness, it was they had their bishops' conference meeting in whatever year, and it was a working group that produced a document. It wasn't the official policy per se of the entire bishops' conference, but it wasn't condemned either. So it was, one of those. The analogy I'll use is if a mayor allows a brothel in the town and doesn't do anything about it, and he tells his friends to go there. I mean, it's not officially legal, but it is, that sort of thing. And we had something similar in Canada. It wasn't in the 60s with universities. It was in the 80s with schools. So I used to be a teacher in the Catholic school system here in Ontario. And
Mm-hmm.
naively, I thought that and I taught religion. I thought that I could just, teach Catholicism. And I got in a lot of trouble. But anyway, it was Catholic schools, and the reason why they become so, I mean, they're barely public. They're public schools with crosses on the doors at this point. And
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, the public schools are probably better, sadly, because at least they're just liberal. They're not liberal while also tarnishing Catholicism. They're just kind of equal opportunity relativists. But anyway, um, in the 1980s, there was a priest who championed government funding for Catholic schools in Ontario. Interesting history, though. The British North America Act from 1867, what's our founding Dominion document, because of Quebec, there legally still to this day there has to be provision for Catholic education, for Canadians. So historically, what that meant was basically almost like charter schools, the funding that would be used for public schooling in a place with a Catholic majority would just be used to fund those schools, but they were still run by the priests, the bishops, and so forth. It kind of worked out okay. As things start to change, things start to liberalize, this whole idea was co-opted by these very liberal priests who acted sort of
Mm-hmm.
as activists within the government and even politicians at times. And then it became the school was fully funded all the way through high school. And that was the end. That was the end of any Catholicity in the schools. From there, it was, I've seen it. I graduated from a Catholic high school in Ontario in 2006, 2007, somewhere around there. And I, even then, compared to now, looks like old school. And then when I think about what I was learning then to what I teach my children now from, the Baltimore Catechism and things like that, it was egregious. But compared to now, it seems like I'm going, 80 years in the past, and there's just been this continual squeezing out, and it's directly tied to this funding, to this choking out, this suffocation by funds from the government.
Well, that's a sad case that has been replicated in American universities
Yeah.
because of, I look at Notre Dame. Love Notre Dame, 3 degrees, and I was baptized there, and my dad taught there for 30 years, and I grew up there. I mean, uh, it's a pretty good brand, if you will.
Yeah.
And yet, the Notre Dame now uh, has not only DEI, but they're perpetuating it and defending it.
Yeah.
And that's because when Joe Biden became president, he had an executive order requiring every government-funded agency, state, local business, anybody who's getting government contracts or funding have to have DEI. And the I includes abortion.
Yep.
And Notre Dame started appointing DEI directors and offices of DEI and all the rest. Now, University of Virginia here has canceled all that and fired everybody. Notre Dame has not.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that, if you will, the 2009 appearance of Obama at Notre Dame, now pretty well established as a milestone in the university's collapse, represented, on the one hand, a total capitulation of Notre Dame in the canonization of the most pro-abortion president in history at the time. And secondly, it was Notre Dame's best fundraising year ever. Now that companionship continues.
Corruptio optima pessima, as they say, the
Si,
corruption of the
amigo.
best of the worst. Yeah, the
Yes.
Catholic, it's the same here. Justin Trudeau, who has officially resigned and whatever. I won't get into the Canadian politics too much, but his father, Pierre Trudeau, was the first, and who had a Catholic persona. He did. He was not, he was an old school Marxist. He understood that as a Quebecois, he had to present himself as someone who could still be acceptable to pious ears, so to speak. But he would do things in Parliament, like he put forth a white paper back in the 60s, really, opening the door to abortion, looking to decriminalize it and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the Catholic prime minister. We had them before, but he really did that. And it was the Liberal Party usually who had the Catholic prime ministers versus the Conservatives, who were largely the Protestants, and it was the Liberals who often wedged through the nonsense, just like the Democrats with Biden and Kennedy and so forth. And c'est la vie. I wanted to talk about two more things. By the way, people, again, check the link in the description for the book. And because we're coming on 40 minutes, and I want to see if we can get through these next 2 points before we reach an hour, because these are really important. So we've gone through the early time, and we get to the point where this term emerges, and it's the seamless garment. And I'll tell you, before I let you talk about that, I'll tell a funny story. When I was a Catholic teacher, we had these agendas, these daily planners that the students would get. And
Mm-hmm.
they were, quote unquote Catholic. So they had quotes. And at this point, I was kind of becoming this very kind of traditionally minded Catholic, and I was learning a lot of things that I hadn't been taught growing up. And I started to get a new spidey sense. And I turned to a page, and I saw a quote from Cardinal Bernardin. And something in my gut, I went, I don't know if I'm supposed to think this. I mean, I think there might be something wrong with some of the things this guy is saying. I'd never heard of him, but there was something. And then I looked it up, and he was pushing this seamless garment thing. And I went in to talk to one of my colleagues who was a mass attending woman and stuff. And she was saying, oh, no, my aunt is a nun in Chicago, and they say seamless garment is Catholic teaching and all this. And I went, I don't think so. There's something wrong about that. So why don't you tell us the history of this whole seamless garment thing and how it pushes this modern social justice that we have now?
Well, I find a couple of preambles uh, in Father Hesburgh and the university's abdication of Humani Vitae, uh, and the teaching on the family, on kids. I'm number 5. My father was number 9. Uh, and I just saw this erosion of defense of the family in general, because after all, the sexual revolution was a big deal.
Yeah.
And it took an awful lot of gumption and guts to stand up against it. And frankly, one of the problems that we might get to, um, when a priest does not agree with Humani Vitae and lives his life in defiance of it, he is not going to be expected to stand up and defend it, because he took Logic 101 and he doesn't want to be a walking contradiction. He's going to be a psycho. So they don't defend it. What filled the vacuum? And that is where the 1970s gave us the vocabulary. Call to Action in 1976 was a disastrous left wing uh, uh, event that synodelity has resurrected.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was number one, and number two, the bishops were, they tell me, much more left wing than they are now, and they came out with the racism pastoral that essentially branded every white in the United States, I should say the majority, as a racist. And that we had to, this Ibram Kendi of late, the New York Times favorite, they were giving the groundwork uh, for that condemnation of where we were. Well, what's the answer? Liberation theology gave us the
Yeah.
answer again in the 70s. So Cardinal uh, Cardinal Bernardin started with the Catholic Conference in the early 1970s, long before he went to Chicago as Archbishop. And the seamless garment reduced the uh, magisterial teachings to the same level, the same woven part of the garment as what we would call today global warming,
Yeah.
uh, any one of a number of liberal causes. What happened there, in my own way of explaining it, the magisterial became a matter of opinion, whereby it didn't have to be taught at all, because why bother people with your opinions? Meanwhile, opinions, especially Marxist and leftist opinions, became magisterial.
Yeah.
And we're finding that now, even in the last 2 months, when we discover that suddenly we're going to hell if we support repatriation of criminals to their home country. So that is where that is where social justice and the seamless garment found their beginnings and their home. Social justice was a concept rather new to theology in the 19th century. It was captured in the Leninist
Mhm.
sense of 1917. Seize the symbols and destroy them if you can, but if you can't, empty them and fill them with your own ideology. Went and did it, and I bless his heart, Cardinal Bernardin did too, and it was so welcome, because who feels uncomfortable having to preach the gospel every week if they can't talk about their political sentiments? And as I said, the book started, how the heck did we get here? And that is the theoretical foundation for how we got here. And the rest of the book deals with the practical consequences of how we got here, which you can pursue in your last question.
Yeah. It seems this whole notion of the seamless garment. I'm going to use the term satanic or Luciferian because um, anti-Christ, anti-God is anti-hierarchical, and the teachings of the church exist in a hierarchy. And we have obviously de fide, and we have de fide proxima, and we have all these teachings of certainty, whether they're explicit in Scripture or whether they're implicit and therefore defined by councils and the popes and so forth. And then when we go down the list, we have common opinions that are the, or we might say we have the ordinary magisterium, the universal ordinary magisterium, the authentic. We have these varying levels where theologians can tell us the certainty. But what happens with the seamless garment notion is that everything is sort of put on the same level of equity or equality
Right.
of teachings. So things that are merely the opinions about something like politics, something like how to handle an immigration situation, let's say, of which maybe good men of goodwill could disagree on this or that point of it. But whoever kind of holds the gavel at the time hammers that thing through as what Catholics are beholden to, which is very irresponsible because they simply don't represent real Catholic teaching, rather the opinions of some prelates, and that causes a lot of
Hmm.
confusion.
It does indeed. The uh, Unfortunately, it led to the acceptance of a lot of perversion
Yeah.
uh, in the society and in the clergy. Uh, the bishops knew about it since the 60s, did nothing. In the 70s, in fact, they almost celebrated it. Uh, the seamless garment weaves it into the rest of social justice. And it was only with the bursting forth of the truth, which the bishops already knew in 2002 with the Boston Globe's
Yeah.
reporting of the scandals, that the bishops recognized big time, we got to deal with this, but how? By the end of the year, I recount how the next meeting of the bishops, June 2002, bishops had embraced the and written the charter for the protection of children and young people, and I add, bishops.
The Dallas Charter, was that the
By
Dallas
exempt,
Charter?
yes, they
Yeah.
exempted themselves.
Yeah.
Uh, but by December, they were, come on, we're just getting hassled left and right by all these people who are bigots, who are demanding. Uh, and we are not going to continually apologize for the scandals for the next 20 years. We're going to change the subject. And in January 2003, they co sponsored a pastoral letter with Mexican bishops on immigration. And immigration, I call it the reputation rehab. That has been the program of the Catholic bishops ever since. Oppose them, and you're a bigot and a racist. And they can suddenly rise above the shame of having two-thirds of their number guilty of covering up for
Grave
scandalous
crimes. Yeah.
and,
Grave crimes.
sorry, thank you,
Yeah.
criminal abuse and assault, and they nobody quit. Two-thirds of them are guilty. The Dallas Morning News had a 6-page insert in 2002 when they showed up in Dallas. They should have turned around and gone home and quit. Instead, they exempted themselves and started calling their critics bigots. And that, frankly, sat a little bit uneasily with my sense of justice. And of course, they haven't addressed it. When Bishop Bruskowitz suggested in 2002 that they address the role of homosexuality and dissent, he didn't even get a second. When
Mhm.
Bishop Strickland in 2018, after McCarrick disaster blew up, they all knew about McCarrick, by the way.
Yeah.
When that happened, um, Strickland, well, you know what happened to him?
Yeah.
He was out of office. So they are not addressing it even to this day, and they are now um, desperate, and they're in a tough situation. It's not just the money, by the way. the tough situation, but they recognize uh, we've been making this our issue for the last 25 years, and it's just blown up in our face. And we look like a bunch of selfish, greed ridden fools.
Yeah, yeah. It's I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of you make your bed and you lay in it. On the other hand, um, it's an unfortunate, tragic thing that's happened because as much as as much as we have the sort of righteous indignation to want to hold our clerics and prelates to the standard that they're supposed to be held to, we also see that it just continues to denigrate the reputation of the church, and it's just it's very much a lose-lose in some ways.
50 million people left in Latin America because of the liberation theologians.
Yeah.
The, the Protestants came along, and the New York Times guy actually said it best. The Catholics preached the social gospel, and the Catholic people went to the evangelicals.
Yeah.
And here we are in the 21st century. 50 million have left since Vatican II within the United States itself.
Well, at least they're concerning themselves with restricting the traditional Latin Mass, right?
I
I won't.
grew up in it.
Yeah.
I love to go to it.
Yeah.
I don't pound the table for it because I am not a liturgist. And by the way, you mentioned an expert a little while ago. Uh, Not I. I wrote this book as an average Catholic layman who is concerned about his church and how we got here. Because the next step is to look at the record, look at the facts, and say, okay, given this, and the two hidden facts that are of so much importance are exactly those that Bruskowitz saw rejected by everyone else in the bishops' conference. The role
Yeah.
of homosexuality
Yeah.
and the role of dissent. They are totally buried because, of course, they are they're unhappy euphemisms I will not indulge in.
Well, to take a global warming term, because they're so concerned with climate change, we can say that's the inconvenient truth that they don't want to admit. Yeah.
And it's gnawing
Yeah.
at the very body of the hierarchy in America.
Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, I'll put the book on the screen here. It is called Charity for Sale. Has the American Catholic Church become just another NGO by Dr. Christopher Manion? I thank you for coming on my show today. That was very informative, and I really recommend the book. I'm very happy to have received it and be able to look through it myself. Is there anywhere people should contact you or find your work? Anything else you'd like to talk about before we sign off here?
Well, I want to point out that Catholics for Catholics,
Yep.
CFORC.com, is putting on a prayer uh, session at Mar-a-Lago on the 19th, the Feast of St. Joseph. And that will be the official uh, launch date of the book. And there will be almost 100 priests will be there to consecrate, to pray for our country.
Okay.
It's a prayer meeting. It's a
Okay.
prayer meeting. And look at c4c.com and look for details there. And you can reach me through C4C or at my Gmail, dr.c.manion at gmail.com.
Okay. I just put it on the screen there, ladies and gentlemen. Catholic Prayer for America, Wednesday, March 19th, 2025 in Florida. And you can see the guests who will be there. Small world, eh? I'm
Some
up here. I'm up here.
amazing people out of jail, people, Vietnam veterans, some wonderful people. I'm honored to be among them.
Yeah, and it's a small world myself being this. I'm up here on the shores of Lake Huron in Ontario, Canada, where no one's ever heard of where I live, which is how I like it. And I look in here and I
Amen.
have a few friends on this panel. And I go, what a small world. This is a funny thing. So yeah, check that out. I'll put the links for all of that in the description area, ladies and gentlemen. And if you do want to support the podcast here, there is a Substack link underneath where I do things that are for premium subscribers and so forth. And the last thing that I have to mention here before we sign off, Christopher, is that in the fall, I am going to the Holy Land, and you can go to kennedyhall.ca/holyland, and you can find the link for
Ah,
that there. And it's a pilgrimage
wonderful.
we're going to all the hot spots: Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, the whole thing. And it's a jam-packed day. We expect to walk about probably 25,000 steps a day, 9 or 10 miles a day. So make sure you've got good running shoes and you've put in some miles before you go. Otherwise, you might pull a muscle. So if you're into that sort of thing, check the link in the description area. And that's all I have. Christopher, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure and education for me. I've learned so much, and I really encourage people to get your book.
Thank you, sir. And safe travels to you, and God bless your work.
Thank you. We'll talk to you all, ladies and gentlemen, sometime soon. This has been Mere Tradition. Until next time, God bless you all.